Well, good morning and welcome back, everyone. Good to have you here. Thanks for joining us again. Hopefully, that means we didn't bore you to death yesterday. Um, yeah, just a quick recap on yesterday's session. We focused on the foundations of a compliant virtual and hybrid AGM. So we address areas around documentation, access, voting integrity, and broadcast visibility. So today we turn to probably one of the most scrutinized and operationally sensitive elements of the meeting, which of course is the Q&A process. Now, again, the GC100's guidance has been very clear in that shareholder engagement must not be diminished in a virtual format. So this means that the ability to ask questions, receive meaningful responses, and ensure transparency in how questions are handled is central to this principle. So today's session, we're really going to focus on the final three provisions, which is 6, 7, and 8. And we're going to address things like the right of shareholders to ask questions in real time and in advance. 2, the obligation to respond appropriately and ensure questions are not inappropriately filtered. And finally, transparency around unanswered questions and post-meeting follow-up. Now, for governance teams, Q&A is where compliance, reputational risk, and meeting control come together, right? And the challenge isn't necessarily about just enabling the question functionality, but rather managing them in a way that's fair, auditable, and procedurally robust. So today we're just going to walk you through what good looks like in practice and demonstrate how structured moderation, clear workflows, and full audit trails supports both engagement and defensibility. And for those who didn't join us yesterday, I'm Luke Crouch. I'll be moderating today's session, and I'm joined again by yours truly, Ben Riley, who's going to demonstrate the Q&A capabilities live on the platform. So Ben, thanks for joining us this morning. Perfect. So look, before we begin today's discussion, just a gentle reminder of the housekeeping items. Just to let you know that the session will be recorded and a link will be shared with you afterwards. Please feel free to participate by submitting your questions or comments via the messaging tab. You'll also notice that in the top right-hand side of your screen, you'll see the request to speak function. So we've actually enabled verbal questions today, which is something that Ben's going to run us through in the demo. We've also uploaded a copy of the GC100's guidance along with a few sample notices of meetings, and that can be found in the Documents tab on the left-hand side of your screen. And then finally, we'll run another survey at the end of the webinar. We just kindly ask if you wouldn't mind taking the time to fill that in, as it just helps us for future webinars. So look, before we begin, I just wanted to quickly refer back to Stuart's question from yesterday, because I feel like it tees us up really nicely for today's discussion. So for the benefit of everybody, I'm just going to reread that for you. So Stuart's question yesterday read, what are your views on shareholders asking questions via messaging on virtual meetings? Is this enough for engagement, or is this moving towards shareholders being able to speak on virtual meetings? So look, Stuart, hopefully by the end of this 30-minute session, we will have answered that for you, right? So look, let's jump straight into focus area number 1, which is all about multiple question channels. Now, again, the GC100's guidance is very clear. Digital participation must preserve scrutiny, and Q&A is where this is really tested, right? So there's 3 provisions to keep in mind, and they are particularly relevant. So 1 is facilitating multiple question channels. 2 is transparency and moderation and grouping. And finally, ensuring that answers are visible or audible to all participants, not just those in the room. So let's have a look at each of these elements. Ben, would you mind just walking us through the platform and showing us how shareholders are able to submit questions via multiple channels?
Absolutely, Luke. Thank you very much, everybody, again for joining us this morning. So I'm sure you can appreciate 30 minutes, a hell of a lot to get through. Thanks for sticking with us yesterday. As with everything, there's probably a few things that we sort of glossed over as we were kind of sprinting through, the kind of governance side of things, the broadcasting, the voting, huge amounts of kind of detail that we were sometimes simplifying. So as with everything, that we're kind of going through over these 2 sessions, please do feel free to send us questions. And equally, after this, reach out to us. We'd be more than happy to kind of set up, one-on-one kind of demos where we can really kind of go into these things in a sort of much more granular detail. So to kind of like really streamline us into this, I just wanted to recap basically to Luke's point. So yesterday we spoke about good governance, documentation. We spoke about the ability to upload and host kind of meeting relevant documents. Somebody did remind me there was one thing that I think is really important just before we get into Q&A, really important that I didn't mention that I do just want to touch upon. So we can, of course, host your sort of stereotypical documents around notice of meetings, annual report and accounts. But in particular, when we get into virtual meetings, there are certain documents that are going to be of a sensitive nature that you in a physical context would make available but wouldn't allow somebody to take away. And what we can actually do on certain documents is disable the ability for somebody to download them. So you'll kind of notice in meetings, you're on your report and accounts. Yep, absolutely. Somebody can kind of view them. There's a download button, they can take them away. But for other more sensitive documents, we can actually disable that feature. And that's really kind of key when you move into the sort of virtual world with regards to, potentially it's director contracts and things like that. So that's a really kind of key attribute that I just wanted to draw attention to. And the last thing as well, with regards to directors, being visible, we spoke about that in the provisions yesterday, is, not only from a broadcast perspective, visibility there, but we do also have the speakers tab here as well. So if you are choosing not to necessarily display all of your directors through the broadcast channels, you can incorporate things like headshot speaker biographies within the speakers tab here as well. So I just wanted to really touch upon those two things that somebody brought to light yesterday that I kind of skipped over, and we'll now kind of move into messaging. So Luke's kind of question to me is sort of demonstrating, the multiple question channels and linking that through to Stuart's question itself. Where we can break that down is written questions and verbal questions. And there is a kind of asterisk next to that, which can also be video questions. So three kind of main attributes attributed to virtual. And we also then potentially have the fourth when we're talking about hybrid meetings, which is the in-room questions, of course, as well. So for this session here, we'll kind of won't necessarily focus on the in-room too much. There are means and tools with regards to capturing in-room questions. And we're seeing, a lot of companies now actually requiring those who are in the room to pre-submit in person those questions. So not necessarily prior to the start of the meeting, but once they have turned up, gone through registration, they'll be directed to a desk where they'll be asked to at least input their name, potentially topic of their question, and in some instances their question themselves. And I'll talk you through why that's important with regards to moderation and focus area 4 shortly, in terms of doing that and collating all of these kind of questions together to give your lives, make your lives a bit easier. So really, as I said, from an online audience perspective, virtual meetings, in particular hybrid meetings, of course, the two main channels here are going to be written and verbal. Now, in my experience and the companies that we have worked with so far, written is king here, basically. We see most question types, 99.9% of individuals who want to ask a question across all forms of meeting from an online perspective submitted in a written channel. And the way that we do that is through the messaging icon, as you can see here. With all of written questions, and I spoke about broadcasting yesterday and the huge amount of flexibility, second to broadcasting and its flexibility and optionality, messaging has that as well. You can go incredibly, high end with multiple question channels and categorize, or you can keep it very simple. I'm going to try and show you, some of those options, but again, with everything, speak to us afterwards and we can kind of work a way that sort of suits your company, because that is key here. Not all channels or methodologies suit every company. There are different ways of doing the same thing. But for the written questions, an individual goes to the messaging tab here. And in essence, we have a categorization. So somebody can self-categorize their questions if needs be. We'd work with you in the lead up to this. So I've seen companies with 15, 20 categories in some instances of sort of hot topics that you might kind of expect to receive questions from or about. Or not. We can actually turn this feature off as well if you're just kind of quite happy to have all questions kind of being submitted under the same sort of banner. But a user can self-categorize their question. They type in their message like so, and they click send. Now, before I do that, there's one key thing here. We have the ability of increasing now. So this is quite a new feature that we had this year of increasing the character count. So in particular, when we were discussing these things with certain companies, we have a kind of base level, a default number of 1,000 characters. We can actually increase that to 3,000 or decrease it if needs be. But generally in the UK, we stick with 1,000. In some instances, we can increase it as well. But a user types in their question, clicks the send icon, they get a message received confirmation, and it comes through and appears in their My Messages folder. Now, this is really important for reasons I'll show you in a moment. But the first thing here to note is that messaging is private. This is not a chat board, right? This is not a Teams chat board. No other shareholders can see each other's questions. Only a shareholder can only see their own questions. And we'll do this in a moment. We'll show you kind of behind the scenes as to how we sort of moderate those questions. So written questions, they type them in here, and there's no real limit. An individual can keep typing their questions in, and we can click the send icon like so. Um, if the question you're thinking about is, well, how do we stop somebody from kind of, from an activism point of view, bombarding the question queue? There are means that we can kind of mute a certain individuals so they can still send their questions in. We're not stifling their voice, but in the back end, there's a way that we can kind of move those questions automatically into a folder so it doesn't clog up channels. So that's the written questions, and then verbal questions. Now, this has kind of sometimes been called the Marmite feature, right? The Marmite feature because sometimes companies think it's going to be a very complex thing that they have to introduce. And for reasons whereby we don't actually see a huge amount of use, as I said earlier on, most questions will come through the written channels, not necessarily the verbal channels. But what I want to give you here is some sense that actually, in our experience, it's quite easy to provide as a service. It's not as complex as some people think, but ultimately, as I said, we don't tend to see a huge number of people using it. So we can kind of see there's a sort of juxtaposition there in terms of, do you offer it, don't you offer it? But certainly when it comes to the guidance and the provisions from the GC100, offering, if you're going to do a virtual meeting, the ability to ask a verbal question is kind of really important here. So if you offer it, when you offer it, basically the way that we facilitate that is through the request to speak button here. So you can see this. If I click the request to speak button, it's going to automatically pull through information as to who I am. We have the ability of them putting in certain other key bits, such as, if they're representing a company, potentially even topic of their question, and they're then able to join that queue. Okay, so and again, similar to the written questions, this is not a free for all. We're not just unmuting somebody. They are joining a queue in a controlled manner for you in the back end to then unmute them at the appropriate point. But it's very straightforward for them. They click that button, they start that call, and they're placed into a queue where they continue to be able to listen to the meeting and all sorts, and they're waiting for their name to be called. So that's really key here. We can, in some instances, speak to the individuals as well prior to that. So we've had, companies ask us to at least sort of check in with regards to connection, ask them about their topic of their question, so we can kind of speak to them and kind of get an understanding as to what they're going to ask about, so that again, we can then place them into a certain point in the meeting that kind of makes it necessarily correlates to other themes of questions. So I'm just going to drop out of that. And I'm just going to then also mention the third channel, which we've not necessarily seen picked up a huge amount in the UK, slightly more popular in Europe and other regions such as Asia. UK not necessarily so much, is the ability to actually visually see the shareholder as well. So a video question. Um, Slightly more complex levels of what we need to basically do to implement that facility. And again, there's a kind of question around return on investment with regards to offering that as a service. But if it's something that you think is, appealing to you as an organization that you want to offer, then do feel free to speak to us and we can kind of talk you through how that works. But video questions, is that kind of, you don't necessarily, in my experience or opinion, need to offer it, but you can offer it. It is there if needs be. And again, it's all built into the platform. There are some examples out there, such as GSK. We've seen Marks and Spencer's offer it as a service as well, to very good effect. Um, so do speak to us. So for me, hopefully that answers slightly Stuart's kind of question and kicks us off with, as a shareholder, how do I input questions? All through the platform. We've got the written, nice and straightforward. It's private channels. We have the ability to ask a verbal question, nice and straightforward. You click the request to speak button. We can as well offer supporting telephone numbers as well. So that's quite important here. So we don't necessarily have just the request to speak button, although for quality reasons, we do primarily try to push people to that. We tend to see that the request to speak button, because it's done over voice VoIP or voice over internet protocol, the quality can be much better than somebody picking up a telephone. So we do tend to try and steer people that way. But ultimately, as a backup, we can also offer telephone numbers and do in a lot of cases have them on the sort of homepage as well. So there's a couple of ways that we can kind of manage the verbal kind of questions. But just speak to us about it, and we'll kind of talk you through that when I've not got 15 minutes left to go on this webinar. So moving over now to focus area 4, shall we, Luke? Do you want to just cue that up?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Ben. And like Ben said, focus area number 4 is really around moderation. Now, moderation is permitted, but the process has to be transparent. So companies should be clear about whether questions are being reviewed, how duplicates are handled, and whether similar questions are going to be grouped. So again, Ben, if you wouldn't mind just kind of showing us the magic on the platform there.
Absolutely, Luke. So, in my opinion, the word and term moderation has become, you know, started to get negative connotations in the world that we kind of work in. When you start to mention moderation, we tend to see sort of people that are, actively against virtual meetings point to that and say, you are stifling our voice, you are stifling the shareholders' voice. And what I'm hopefully going to try to do today is say to you, that's not the case here whatsoever. Moderation, is more along the lines of potentially giving you greater control and potentially, in some instances, greater visibility around these multiple question types that you're providing to shareholders. You're giving them greater voice, written questions, verbal questions, video questions, in the room questions. And for you as a company, you need to be able to effectively group certain themes together and have sort of control over that without stifling that voice. So, moderation. How does it work? So, in essence, this is the behind the scenes. This is what you have access to as an organization, as a COSEC team, a deputy COSEC team. This is where we control all of the question types that kind of come in. So we've got the written questions that I submitted earlier, as you can see here, 2 questions, and both of them being automatically tagged with those topics that I mentioned about. And then ultimately, if somebody types or presses on the verbal question button or the request to speak, they also appear here. So for you, it is one place. You are starting at one place. All roads lead to the needs review channel. You're not having to look at multiple screens that you might have had to do in the past. You're not having to look over here for written and over here for verbal. It's all in one place. And we can give access to this to as many of your staff as needs be. We've seen teams with 20 SMEs all logged into this with multiple folders, all with their kind of dedicated, sort of looking for if something's tagged as remuneration, they're going to pick it up. They're going to potentially be able to supply an answer to that. And we've also seen smaller teams where actually all questions are just going to be pushed through. So huge amounts of flexibility built into this over multiple years of working with organizations and issuers to really streamline this so that we can go as complex or as simple for each company. But in essence, providing you with that control over all of these question types in the room, written, verbal, and potentially video as well. So they all come through to the needs reviewed folder. And this is really where you're able to start to group those questions together potentially. So you can start to see of tags, questions. These 2 questions are going to be on dividends. So we might want to take them together. We've also got a question on remuneration as an audio and potentially another question that we don't necessarily know the topic about. And you can then start to say, well, actually, do you know what? We're going to start to take the questions on dividends first. And as with all of our sort of, UI, it's built around being as easy and as transparent for you as possible. So you can drag questions around into the relevant folders. And we'll get on to, visibility and displaying them shortly. But ultimately, there's a really kind of key one here that I just want to pick up on, which is, for shareholders thinking my question is going to be sent off into the ether and you're not going to answer it because it's a tricky one. That's not the case. You actually have the ability of directly communicating with people as well. So for we've seen this used to quite good effect, where, a company is encouraging shareholders to submit their questions early on, but you've got quite a long presentation prior to the Q&A. You can actually directly respond to a shareholder. Thank you, for your question. Whatever it might be, we'll address that shortly in the Q&A, or thank you for your question. It's not necessarily relevant to the business of the meeting, but we'll get back to you afterwards. You can directly respond to those questions. And ultimately, the shareholder will see that, and you'll see we get a reply received. So it's not keeping the shareholder in the dark, basically. And that's where that kind of, in my experience, that idea of moderation is that you're upfront with them, you're transparent, is that we've got your question. we're going to answer it. Or potentially, actually, this is not the world for it, or this is not the sort of platform for it, but we're going to get back to you afterwards. And we've seen that used to really good effect with potentially IR teams and comms teams in the back end, then providing email addresses for them to directly communicate with. So, you know, moderation. It's got a bit of a bad rap, but actually it's there to really allow you to have greater transparency and communication, in my experience, with the end shareholder as well. So, you know, being able to, as I said, group questions together. I think there's also another thing here as well that sometimes gives shareholders a bit of a, they're kind of like, wow, we can't see what you're doing in the back end. Let me just show you something here, just to give you clarity. If you were to edit a question, a raw question coming in, so we've got this question here, and we've sometimes seen that, correct spelling mistakes and various other bits and pieces in my experience. To put it to rest, if you were to edit the actual original question here, like so, the shareholder will actually see that. So you're not shying away from this, right? The shareholder will actually see you edit that question. And my experience, I've never seen a company edit an original question. What we've seen though is that all questions are treated in their raw format. They're retained in their raw original format. And, we'll get onto that shortly in terms of publishing them potentially post-event. But we have the ability of duplicating questions. And to Luke's point earlier on, what we can then do is we can duplicate the original question. And if we're getting sort of 10 questions on the subject of dividend, we can then potentially sort of start to edit that question to say, actually, do you know what? Also received from, person A, B, C, and D. And so when that's kind of read aloud by the COSEC and answered by the chair, you're kind of sort of saying, you know what, we've had the same question on topic A from persons A, B, C, and D. Thank you all so much for submitting that question. This is kind of what it is, and the chair can then answer it in a kind of collective if needs be. So you can kind of, work it to your advantage, but also to shareholders' advantage because, nobody wants a really drawn out long Q&A. But, it's really kind of getting to the heart of you're not shying away from questions here. You're being able to do that. And then ultimately, final thing from your side where we've seen, things to good effect is we have the ability to respond directly to the shareholder, but we can also provide a proposed answer for the chair. So this is kind of key, and it sort of links into the next section, which is visibility of questions and answers. Okay. So I'm just trying to make sure that I've not missed anything that's important. We've spoken about the ability for you to have tags. So really kind of key, as you're getting more questions, tagging certain questions with themes, which in and of itself allows you to group questions together. The ability for you to directly respond to shareholders, so you're not shying away and giving them the kind of, security and knowledge that their question hasn't been sent out into the ether and is not going to be addressed. The abilities for kind of, dealing with, questions on the same subject or multiple questions on the same subject and grouping them together in a manner where you're not tweaking the raw question, the original question. Everything that you receive is kept in its original format as best as we can and ultimately provided to you after the meeting to deal with in the manner that you want to. So I think that nicely segues us into focus area 4, Luke.
Yeah, absolutely, Ben. And the fourth focus area, or three for today, is the element of visibility, right? Now, if questions are addressed, the exchange must be observable by all participants, not just necessarily those physically in the room. So, in a hybrid setting in particular, responses given in the room must be equally accessible, audible to the audience online. So, again, back over to you, Ben, if you wouldn't mind just showing us how that looks in practice.
Perfect, Luke. If anybody can tell, the reason we've got these segues is solely so I can kind of just have a quick drink before we kind of get into the next bit, which is helping my voice. So, again, conscious of time, so we're going to kind of fly through this. Please reach out to us afterwards. We can do this in a much more slower pace, far more in depth. But really, in terms of the next step, so you've received all your question types here. Let's start answering some of them, shall we? Well, ultimately, the way that we do that is we move and drag and drop them into one of these folders called the reviewed folder. Anything that's in the reviewed folder is displayed to your directors, to your COSEC team. It's a very simple viewer that can be displayed on an iPad, on a comfort monitor, on whatever it is in whatever setting we're working with. Going back to the broadcast that we spoke to yesterday, simple iPads right the way through to large comfort monitors. A very simple display that shows the name of the shareholder, the question, the tags, so they can see a really quick snapshot of it. And then ultimately, as I said, your ability to basically move questions into that folder simply by dragging and dropping. And any question that you might not necessarily need to take or want to take, and I say want, again, here we're all about transparency and visibility. It might have been because it's not relevant to the business of the meeting and you've directly responded to them. We'll get back to you afterwards. We're not deleting it. We can simply archive that question. So you still retain it. But in terms of those questions that you have received and you are going to take, the reviewed folder here, this is also where you can potentially give your chair supporting answers as well. So again, something that's not necessarily seen by the shareholder, but as we all know and you do is it might be a really complex question on the report and accounts. See page 4 of whatever it is, A&R. So you can put that in there. And then ultimately, these questions are then seen by the chair, the top table. Now, in my experience, the best way of managing this is a kind of call and response from yourselves. So we will traditionally see the COSEC manage the kind of Q&A or sort of like reading aloud. So it will be the COSEC on the top table to say, Chair, our first question is from Ben Riley. This is the question, what will the weather be like today? And the chair will then provide an answer. And you'll see we've kind of got that supporting answer and a topic tag there. Once the chair has answered that question, we can then simply move that into the answered folder. And the next question moves to the top of the list. Chair, our next question again seems to be from Ben Riley. He really does have a few questions. It's whatever this is. What did you have for breakfast? The chair will then answer, maybe pass to another director if needs be, but all of those directors can kind of see the topic of it, what it's going to kind of potentially be about, know potentially whether it's going to come to them. Once it's addressed, we move it into the answered folder and the next question moves to the top. And in this instance here, it's an audio question. So very clear and obvious. We know that we're going to go to the telephone lines. We know that Ben Riley is going to be heard by the meeting and is going to ask his question and have that question addressed ultimately. So, really kind of clear and obvious for yourselves. And then ultimately, I think the final thing from me really, which is really key, it's that sort of visibility of questions and answers where we've seen, really kind of, best practice, good use of this is that post event. So not just live answering the questions as they kind of come through in Q&A, but post event is then publishing all of those questions with an answer attributed to them. So including the ones that you might not necessarily have answered live during the meeting for whatever reason, but in most cases they will have been done, but an answer posted on your website going full circle right back to the original provisions of 1.2, which is, ultimate transparency in an AGM section on your website. Here is the recording of the meeting, and here are the questions that we received and the answers attributed to it. So really kind of, open for you to sort of like publish those and make sure people can see that you're not shying away, because we know that you wouldn't. I think that kind of brings us to a conclusion with regards to those elements really. And as I said, completely appreciate I'm sprinting through this. There's a lot to get through. Reach out to us afterwards if you'd like to see this. We'll set up some more kind of one-on-one demos, and kind of go through how this works and can work for you in practice, basically. But there's some really kind of key things here where the provisions that we're kind of, or you're being asked to sort of, action completely straightforward to provide them. And again, from those kind of pushing back, this facility, as you can see, is not to stifle voice, but to ultimately help you kind of manage multiple Q&A kind of channels, including the in-room element as well, feeding through into here. So in-room questions feeding through into here, where you can kind of order those and make sure that you're treating in-room and online exactly the same. No one sort of group of individuals is getting preference over the other. Back to you, Luke. I think we've got a minute left.
Yeah, perfect. Thanks, Bench. I know you've had to rush through that, but hopefully that was quite clear for the audience. So look, in the essence of time, we just want to take a couple questions from the audience because I can see there's a few that's come through. Stuart, hopefully that answers yours from yesterday. But if I just have a look here, so we've got a question here from Oliver Hurst, and it reads, if we have both in-room and online questions, how do we ensure that one group isn't prioritized over the other?
In-room and online. Okay, speedy one that I kind of touched upon before, which is basically the way that we've seen this managed really well with other companies doing a sort of hybrid context is asking shareholders who are physically attending to actually just register their question as well. So going to a desk and saying, I want to ask a verbal question today. I want to stand up in the meeting and ask a question. My name is XYZ, whatever it might be. And you can then equally go as far to say, well, can you give me your topic? Are you willing to give us the question that you're going to ask? And we've seen shareholders reciprocate that really well. So, you then input that into our system. So you type that question in, whatever the shareholder's name is, this is going to be their question or their topic. And then basically in the back end, again, alongside your audio and your online written, you are then able to see that you've got John Smith in the room, wants to ask a verbal question, and you can then order that to sort of suit your needs. So basically, you're treating him in the same way that you're treating the online written and the online verbal. So no one is getting kind of preference. Whether you then start with an in-room or start with an online written is up to your prerogative, but you're kind of treating them in exactly the same way in my experience, and it's been done to very good effect.
Perfect. Thanks, Ben. Right. I'm so glad to see this because we've got a caller through as well. Who's someone who's used the request to speak function. So we've got Will McCullum on the line. Will, if you wouldn't mind going ahead and asking a question.
Yeah, thank you both for taking my question. I appreciate you can't give us exact figures on a call like this, but would you be able to give us an indication as to your pricing structure? Thank you very much.
Thank goodness we've got somebody actually kind of calling. That's fantastic. Because actually, you can see here, we're trying to emulate exactly how it would be in the live AGM context. We can see the caller. Thank you so much. Was it Will for dialing in today in that question? I'm not going to try and give a political answer here, but I might fall into that trap, which is ultimately pricing changes company to company and the options that you choose. But what I will say is the way that we kind of see pricing increase or decrease is twofold. First and foremost, we price on a kind of licensing structure. So that is based on your market cap size and the number of individuals that you have on your register. So if you are a high cap company, large cap company, sorry, with huge numbers on your register, you're going to be paying more than a much lower cap company with, small numbers on your register. So small, medium, and large kind of approach with regards to licensing. And then ultimately, as I said on the last call, what really influences your kind of price and sees that kind of start to go through is the style of broadcasting. So you've got the what we refer to as that remote broadcasting service, where we're using that infrastructure or eternal infrastructure. That is, of course, going to be cheaper than if you want all the bells and whistles of multiple cameras in the room, staging, etc. And you're working with an external AV company, of course. So really, where you can start to see a virtual meeting in particular kind of you know working is we've seen prices start at £3,500 for a fully remote virtual AGM for a small cap company. And that can start to increase, into the 5K, potentially the 10K, dependent upon the in-room elements that you want regarding broadcasting. Okay, so that hopefully isn't too political, but again, speak to us. Come direct to us. Ask us for, a quote. We're more than happy to kind of speak to you and provide you with a quote for your AGM.
That's perfect. Thanks, Ben. Hopefully that answers your question, Will. So look, quick wrap up and summarize, guys, in the essence of time here. A couple takeaways, if anything. So one is access ensures parity. Moderation requires transparency, and visibility preserves scrutiny. And when handled correctly, Q&A becomes not necessarily a risk point, but a demonstration of governance integrity in a digital environment. But yeah, thank you so much, guys. I really appreciate your time. Thank you for joining us. I hope you found that useful. But yeah, enjoy the rest of your day.